I was standing in the middle of a charity dinner when my son rolled up his sleeve and showed everyone a fresh tattoo that read, "My mother was my first mistake." People laughed. Some looked away. One woman nearly dropped her wine glass. My son smiled like he'd finally won something. 3 months later, I signed papers that took away the one thing he needed most, sold the house he thought was his future, and disappeared from his life without leaving a forwarding address. One of us can cover up what? Hello, everyone. Grace here. I'll tell you right now, there are insults, and then there are public executions disguised as jokes. When a grown son turns his own mother into entertainment, he's usually hiding something bigger than anger. And in this story, he absolutely was. My name is Blythe Maribelle Ashford. I'm 69 years old, widowed, and until recently, I lived in a small Pennsylvania town called Cedar Hollow, where people still wave from porches and pretend they don't gossip, while somehow knowing everyone's business before breakfast. For most of my life, I worked as a court stenographer. That job teaches you something most people never learn. People lie with confidence. They lie while smiling. They lie while crying. They lie while placing a hand over their heart. And if you sit in enough courtrooms, you begin noticing tiny cracks before everyone else does. A hesitation, a missing detail, a story rehearsed one too many times. The funny thing is that after 32 years of recording other people's lies, I completely missed the biggest one in my own family. My son, Calvin. If you'd asked me 20 years ago what kind of man he'd become, I would have described someone entirely different from the person standing in my memories now. He wasn't born cruel. He wasn't one of those children who enjoyed hurting animals or breaking things. He was bright, funny, curious. When he was 8, he used to sit beside me on rainy afternoons building little ships out of popsicle sticks while asking impossible questions. Do fish get lonely? Can clouds get tired? If Dad dies first, who gets his fishing hat? Back then, the future still looked safe. Then, life happened. My husband, Raymond, died from a stroke 14 years ago. Not one of those long illnesses that gives everyone time to prepare. One ordinary Tuesday, he was mowing the lawn. 3 days later, I was choosing a casket. Something changed in Calvin after that. Not immediately. At first, he seemed stronger, protective, helpful. He fixed things around the house, called more often, checked on me. But somewhere over the following years, grief turned into entitlement. Then entitlement turned into expectation. And expectation slowly became resentment. Every crisis in Calvin's life somehow landed on my doorstep. His divorce, his business failure, his tax problems, his credit card debt, his second business failure, the expensive truck he couldn't afford, the girlfriend who convinced him to invest in imported outdoor saunas because apparently wealthy suburbanites were desperate to sweat in handcrafted cedar boxes. Every disaster arrived wrapped in the same sentence. Mom, I just need a little help getting back on my feet. The first time, I believed him. The 10th time, I wanted to. The 20th time, I stopped asking questions. Mothers are strange that way. We can watch a grown man make the same mistake for 15 years and still see the little boy who once cried because his goldfish died. The house became the biggest example. 5 years earlier, Calvin was weeks away from losing everything after his divorce. The bank was circling, his debts were piling up. His credit score looked like a medical emergency. That's when I stepped in. What Calvin told people afterward was simple. I bought a house. What actually happened was far more complicated. The money came from a family trust my husband and I had established decades earlier. The property was protected under legal structures Calvin barely bothered to understand. I didn't advertise any of that. I wasn't interested in embarrassing my son. If letting him believe he was a self-made homeowner preserved a little dignity, I could live with that. What I didn't know was that dignity had become the very thing he was preparing to sell. About 6 months before the tattoo incident, I started noticing changes. Not dramatic ones. Tiny things. The sort of things most people ignore. Calvin suddenly became very interested in my health. He called more often, asked unusual questions, whether I ever forgot appointments, whether I still drove at night, whether I ever misplaced important documents. At first, I assumed he was worried about me. After all, I was 69. Then the questions became strangely specific. Do you ever leave the stove on? No. You sure? Yes. Because that happens a lot at your age. That last part bothered me. Not because it was insulting, because it sounded rehearsed, like something someone says after hearing it elsewhere. Then came the charity dinner. The invitation arrived 2 weeks before the event. Calvin called personally. That alone should have warned me something was different. Mom, I'd really love for you to come. Those exact words. I'd really love for you to come, not if you're free. Not if you want. He wanted me there. Specifically. I remember standing in my kitchen after hanging up. The smell of cinnamon coffee cake was drifting from the oven. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. And for the first time in months, I felt hopeful. Maybe we were turning a corner. Maybe all families go through rough seasons. Maybe the distance I'd been feeling wasn't permanent. The event was hosted at the old Hawthorne Mill downtown, a restored brick building converted into an upscale event venue. The kind of place that serves miniature crab cakes the size of poker chips and calls them appetizers. I arrived wearing a navy blue dress and the silver brooch Raymond had given me on our 25th anniversary. The room was full of local business owners, investors, city officials, and people who liked hearing themselves talk. Calvin was already there, and he looked nervous, not emotional, not excited. Nervous, like a man waiting for something, or someone. The first crack appeared 20 minutes after I arrived. I noticed Calvin speaking quietly with a tall man in an expensive charcoal suit. The man's name tag read, Miles Harrow. At the time, it meant nothing to me. I wouldn't understand the importance of that name until much later. But I did notice one thing. When Calvin pointed toward me, Miles looked directly at me. Not casually, carefully. The way attorneys sometimes study witnesses before testimony begins. A strange chill ran down my spine. Then Calvin smiled. Not at me. At him. And suddenly, for reasons I couldn't explain, I had the feeling that I wasn't attending a family event. I was attending something that had been planned, and I was standing exactly where someone wanted me to stand. The charity dinner continued around me as if nothing unusual had happened, but that feeling in my chest refused to leave. I've spent too many years watching people testify under oath to ignore instinct. Instinct had kept innocent people from making terrible deals. Instinct had exposed lies that looked flawless on paper. And right now, instinct was telling me that my son wasn't simply hosting me at a fundraiser. He was positioning me. For the next hour, I watched more than I talked. That's another habit my old job left behind. Most people think silence means weakness. They don't realize silence is where you collect information. Calvin drifted from table to table, introducing investors, local business owners, and city officials to one another. Every conversation somehow circled back to his newest venture. I'd heard pieces about it before, though never enough to understand exactly what he was building. Luxury cabins, wellness retreats, exclusive experiences. The description changed depending on who was listening. To one person, it was real estate. To another, it was hospitality. To someone else, it was a lifestyle brand. Whenever details became necessary, Calvin suddenly became vague. That was another thing I noticed. People hiding bad ideas usually hide behind big words. Near the dessert table, I finally found myself standing beside an old acquaintance named Helen Bruckner. We'd known each other for years. She leaned closer and lowered her voice. "Your son seems busy." "He usually is." "These investor people seem very interested." I followed her gaze. Miles Harrow was speaking with two men in tailored suits. They weren't eating. They weren't drinking. They were studying architectural drawings spread across a cocktail table. My stomach tightened. Helen noticed my expression. "You didn't know?" "Know what?" She blinked. "Oh, I assumed Calvin told you." "Told me what?" Now she looked uncomfortable. "The development project?" The room suddenly felt warmer. "What development project?" Helen hesitated. "Maybe I shouldn't." "What development project, Helen?" She sighed. "I heard they're looking at several properties outside town. New luxury townhomes, walking trails, retail spaces, that sort of thing." I stared at her. "And Calvin is involved?" "That's what everyone says." I forced a smile. "Interesting." But it wasn't interesting. It was alarming. Because Calvin had never mentioned any development project. Not once. And Calvin talked constantly when he thought money was coming. The fact that he hadn't mentioned this told me one of two things. Either it wasn't important, or it was extremely important. A few minutes later, Calvin appeared beside me, carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. "Having fun?" "I've had worse evenings." He laughed. Then I decided to test something. "Helen says you're involved in some kind of development project." The smile didn't disappear, but it tightened, only slightly. Most people would have missed it. I didn't. "Just business stuff." "What kind of business stuff?" "Nothing finalized." "What are you building?" He took a drink. "We're exploring opportunities." That wasn't an answer. It was a politician's escape route. I kept my expression neutral. "Sounds exciting." "Yeah." Then he changed the subject immediately. Too quickly. The crack widened. For the next 30 minutes, I paid attention to something else. How often Calvin looked toward me. Not lovingly, not protectively, monitoring. Almost as if he needed to know exactly where I was. Exactly who I spoke to. Exactly what I heard. By then I was beginning to feel less like his mother and more like an object that needed supervision. Then something even stranger happened. A woman I'd never met approached our table. She introduced herself as a healthcare consultant. At first, the conversation seemed ordinary. Then she asked me whether I still lived alone, whether I drove, whether I handled my own finances, whether I ever felt confused managing paperwork. The questions came wrapped in smiles, but they weren't normal dinner conversation, not even close. I answered politely, then watched her leave. A minute later, she joined Miles Harrow's group. My pulse slowed. Not from fear, from clarity. Courtrooms teach you something important. The moment evidence begins fitting together, panic disappears. You stop guessing. You start observing. And for the first time that evening, I became absolutely certain of one thing. none of this was accidental. Not the guests, not the conversations, not the questions, not even my invitation. Somewhere beneath the surface of this perfectly polished charity event, a story was being built. And somehow, I had become one of its main characters. I just didn't know what role my son wanted me to play yet. Then Calvin stepped onto the small stage near the center of the room. Someone handed him a microphone. The crowd quieted. Applause spread through the hall. I noticed Miles Harrow move closer. I noticed several people pull out their phones. And I noticed Calvin glance toward me before he began speaking. Only once. But it was enough. The kind of look people give right before they reveal something they've rehearsed many times. Something they can't wait for others to see. I had no idea that within minutes my son was about to humiliate me in front of everyone in that room. And I had even less idea that the tattoo wasn't the worst thing he had planned. Calvin always loved an audience. When he was 10 years old, he once stood on our dining room table and performed an entire magic show he'd learned from a library book. Every trick failed. The cards fell apart. The coin disappeared into an air vent. The rabbit was actually our terrified cat, Winston. But Calvin kept smiling, kept performing, kept believing people were watching because he was special. Standing in the Hawthorne Mill that night, I realized that part of him had never changed. He adjusted the microphone and flashed the same confident smile. The room quieted. Glassware stopped clinking. Conversations faded. Nearly 100 people turned toward him. Thank you all for being here tonight. Applause followed. Calvin launched into a speech about entrepreneurship, resilience, community investment, and building a better future. The sort of polished language that sounds impressive until you realize it contains very little actual information. People nodded anyway. They always do, especially when expensive suits are involved. I watched from my table while he worked the room exactly the way lawyers work juries. Every joke landed. Every pause felt practiced. Every smile appeared at the right moment. And all the while, I kept noticing something strange. He wasn't looking around the room randomly. He kept checking specific faces. Miles Harrow, the healthcare consultant, a few investors, then me, always back to me. 15 minutes into the speech, he shifted gears. His voice softened. The room leaned closer. I think all of us carry things from our past. A few people nodded. Sometimes those things make us stronger. More nodding. Sometimes they hold us back. I felt my stomach tighten. The direction of the conversation had changed. My journey hasn't always been easy. The room became quieter. I grew up with challenges most people never saw. There it was, the first real lie. Not because his childhood had been perfect. No childhood is. But because he was already rewriting history. I could hear it happening in real time. My father passed away when I was still finding my way in life. That part was true. My family environment became complicated, vague, convenient, designed to invite assumptions. People started listening even harder. Calvin lowered his head dramatically. There are moments when you realize you've spent years carrying someone else's mistakes. My hands folded together in my lap, still calm, still listening. Because now I knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't giving a business speech, he was building a narrative. And every person in that room was being guided toward the same conclusion. Poor Calvin, difficult family, overcame adversity, succeeded anyway. A woman near me actually murmured, "Good for him." I almost laughed. Then Calvin said something that made the room go completely silent. "You know what changed my life?" He paused. I finally stopped pretending. The crowd waited. "So tonight I want to show you something." My pulse slowed, not faster, slower. That always happened when I sensed something bad was coming. Calvin stepped away from the microphone stand. The spotlight followed him. Several phones lifted higher. People expected an announcement, an engagement, a business launch, some exciting surprise. Instead, he rolled up his left sleeve, slowly, deliberately, like a magician revealing the final trick. The tattoo appeared inch by inch, fresh, black ink, still healing, still red around the edges. For one strange second, I couldn't process the words. I saw the letters. I read them. But my mind refused to connect them. Then reality caught up. My mother was my first mistake. The entire room froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the servers stopped walking. I heard someone whisper, "Jesus." Another person laughed nervously. Then more laughter followed. Not loud, not comfortable. The kind people use when they don't know how they're supposed to react. I looked directly at my son. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't ashamed. He looked proud, as if he'd just unveiled a masterpiece. Then he raised the microphone again. "I think honesty matters." A few awkward chuckles echoed through the room. My eyes moved across the crowd. Some people looked horrified. Others looked entertained. Several looked directly at me. That was the moment I understood something important. The tattoo wasn't for Calvin. It wasn't even about me. It was for them. Every person in that room. A public exhibit. A declaration. He wanted strangers to believe there was a reason a son would permanently write something like that onto his body. He wanted them filling in the blanks themselves. Abusive mother. Controlling mother. Damaging mother. Whatever story they imagined would work in his favor. And suddenly, all the strange conversations from earlier made perfect sense. The questions, the healthcare consultant, the careful introductions, the constant observation. This wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a performance. Months of preparation wrapped in a few seconds of theater. Then Calvin looked directly at me, right there in front of everyone, and smiled. Not warmly, not apologetically, triumphantly, as if he'd finally cornered an opponent. "Blythe," he said into the microphone. Not mom, not mother. Blythe. The room became painfully quiet. "What do you think?" 100 faces turned toward me, waiting, watching, hoping for tears, or anger, or a scene, anything dramatic, anything entertaining. Instead, I slowly picked up my glass of water, took a sip, set it back down, and asked the only question that mattered. "Do you mean it?" The smile on Calvin's face never moved, not even slightly. Every letter. The answer landed harder than the tattoo itself, because now there was no misunderstanding, no joke, no excuse, no drunken mistake, just intention, pure and simple. And as I sat there staring at the sun I barely recognized, one thought entered my mind with absolute clarity. This wasn't the beginning of something. It was the end. I just didn't know yet how much my son was about to lose. The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds. It felt like 3 years. Nobody knew what to do. Not Calvin, not the guests, not even me. Because there are certain moments in life that don't fit inside normal social rules. What exactly is the proper response when your own son publicly unveils a tattoo calling you his first mistake? Applause would be insane. Sympathy would be awkward. Silence was all anyone had. Then someone near the back laughed. Another person joined in. The tension broke. Conversation slowly returned. People started pretending they hadn't just witnessed something ugly. That's what adults do when discomfort enters a room. They decorate it and call it normal. Calvin stepped down from the stage like he'd accomplished something important. Several investors immediately approached him. One man slapped him on the shoulder. Another shook his hand. I watched from my chair, not crying, not angry, just observing. The same way I used to observe witnesses before they destroyed themselves under cross-examination. Because once emotion disappears, details become visible, and details were everywhere. Miles Harrow walked directly toward Calvin, the developer, the man who had been studying me all evening. They spoke quietly, too quietly to hear. But I noticed something interesting. Miles glanced toward me twice during the conversation, not with pity, with evaluation, like someone inspecting property before signing paperwork. The feeling returned immediately. The tattoo wasn't the destination. It was a step, part of a larger plan. A few minutes later, a woman approached my table, older than me, elegant, silver hair pinned neatly above a navy silk dress. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I looked up. She seemed genuine. For what? She hesitated. For having to experience that. I smiled politely. Thank you. She glanced toward Calvin. That wasn't bravery. No, it looked rehearsed. That surprised me. Apparently, I wasn't the only person noticing things. The woman introduced herself as Judge Eleanor Finch, recently retired from the county court. We spoke briefly. Nothing dramatic. But before leaving, she leaned closer. Mrs. Ashford, I spent 40 years listening to testimony. So did I. Something flickered across her face. Understanding, recognition. Then she quietly said something that stayed with me long after that night ended. People rarely build a stage unless they plan to perform more than one act. Then she walked away. I sat there turning those words over in my mind. More than one act. Exactly. The tattoo had required planning, appointments, money, preparation, audience selection, timing. None of this happened accidentally, which meant one question mattered more than all the others. What came next? About 20 minutes later, I finally stood. My chair scraped softly against the floor. Several nearby guests watched me, probably expecting confrontation, a speech, tears. Instead, I picked up my purse, smoothed my dress, and walked calmly toward the exit. Halfway there, Calvin intercepted me. His smile was gone now. What are you doing? I'm leaving. That's it? I looked at him. What exactly were you expecting? His jaw tightened. For the first time all evening, he seemed uncertain, almost disappointed, as though I'd ruined part of the performance by refusing to react. Mom? No. His eyes narrowed. I almost never interrupted people, especially family. But tonight was different. You answered my question. What question? Whether you meant it. The hallway suddenly felt very quiet. I did. Good. His confidence returned immediately. He thought he'd won something. Then I said the last thing he expected. Thank you for being honest. The confusion on his face was almost immediate. Before he could respond, I walked past him. Straight through the lobby, out the front doors, into the cool Pennsylvania night. The air smelled like rain and freshly cut grass. Behind me, laughter and music still drifted from the building. Ahead of me sat my car. And somewhere between those two places, a decision finally settled inside me. For years, I'd been asking myself whether Calvin would ever change. That night, I received my answer. The next question was far more important. What was I going to do about it? And by sunrise, I would discover that the tattoo wasn't even the worst thing my son had done. I didn't sleep that night, not because of the tattoo. Oddly enough, that wasn't what kept me awake. By midnight, the words themselves had already lost their sting. The real problem was something else. I couldn't stop thinking about Miles Harrow, about the healthcare consultant, about the strange questions, about the feeling that I'd accidentally walked into the middle of a conversation that had started long before I arrived. At 2 a.m, I made chamomile tea and sat at my kitchen table. The house was silent except for the ticking of the old Seth Thomas clock hanging above the doorway. Raymond used to hate that clock. Said it sounded like a tiny hammer attacking the wall. That night, it sounded like a countdown. The next morning, things became even stranger. At 9:17 a.m., my phone rang. The caller ID showed a local medical office. I almost ignored it. Almost. Mrs. Ashford? A cheerful woman asked. Yes. I'm calling to confirm your cognitive wellness consultation scheduled for next Thursday. I frowned. My what? There was a pause. Your cognitive assessment? I don't have a cognitive assessment. The woman sounded confused. Our records show the appointment was requested 2 weeks ago. By whom? Another pause. I'm sorry, ma'am. I can't disclose that information. I thanked her and hung up. For several seconds, I simply stared at the phone. Then I opened my notebook, a habit from decades in courtrooms. Whenever something feels important, write it down. 9:17 a.m. Unrequested cognitive evaluation. Someone initiated contact. I underlined the last sentence twice. At 11:40, the second thing happened. I was trimming lavender bushes in my front yard when my neighbor, Earl Patterson, wandered over from across the street. Earl was 74, retired, and physically incapable of keeping information to himself. If a squirrel sneezed 3 blocks away, Earl would somehow know about it. We exchanged the usual small talk. Weather, property taxes, his ongoing feud with a raccoon. Then he said something that made me stop clipping entirely. Your boy stopped by a couple weeks ago. My stomach tightened. Calvin? Yep. I kept my voice casual. What for? Earl shrugged. Asked how you were doing. That sounded harmless. Then he continued. Wanted to know if I'd noticed you forgetting things. The pruning shears froze in my hand. What exactly did he ask? Earl scratched his chin. Oh, little stuff. Whether you seemed confused, whether you ever got lost driving, whether I'd seen you leave the stove running. The exact same questions, the same pattern, the same language. A cold feeling settled into my chest. Not panic, recognition. Because suddenly those conversations at the charity dinner looked very different. The healthcare consultant, the medical appointment, the carefully placed questions. None of it was random. Someone was collecting a narrative, and narratives are dangerous things when enough people start repeating them. That afternoon, I drove downtown. Not to confront Calvin, not yet. Instead, I visited a small coffee shop near the courthouse called Copperfinch Cafe. The owner, Rita, had known me for years. She handed me a cinnamon scone without asking. Rough morning? You could say that. I took a seat near the window and opened my notebook again. For nearly an hour, I wrote down everything I could remember. The dinner, the guests, the conversations. Miles Harrow, the questions, the appointment. Earl's comments, piece by piece. Fact by fact. No assumptions, no emotions. Just observations. By the time I finished, 3 pages were full, and one conclusion had become impossible to ignore. My son wasn't simply trying to embarrass me. Embarrassment would have ended with the tattoo. This was continuing, growing, moving, like pieces on a chessboard. The question wasn't whether Calvin was planning something. The question was what he needed people to believe about me before he made his next move. And for the first time, I found myself wondering whether that house he'd fought so hard to keep was somehow connected to all of it. That evening, when I got home, there was a large envelope waiting in my mailbox. No return address, just my name written neatly across the front. Inside was a brochure, a glossy brochure. Luxury townhomes, private walking paths, upscale retail space, future development opportunities. At the bottom of the page was a familiar logo, Harrow and Vale Properties. And suddenly, Miles Harrow's interest in me made a lot more sense. I spent most of the next morning staring at that brochure, not because it was particularly impressive. I've seen enough glossy sales material over the years to know they're all built from the same ingredients: attractive families, happy dogs, expensive landscaping, and promises, always promises. This brochure was no different. But one sentence kept catching my eye: transforming underutilized properties into premium communities. Underutilized properties. That phrase bothered me, because developers rarely invent language. They choose it carefully, the same way attorneys choose words, the same way witnesses choose words. Every phrase exists for a reason. I poured myself coffee and spread the brochure across my kitchen table. Then I grabbed a county map from a drawer, an old habit. When something feels wrong, start with facts. The proposed development area sat on the eastern edge of Cedar Hollow. Several properties were highlighted. Some already sold. Some marked as pending acquisition. One of the highlighted zones sat alarmingly close to Calvin's neighborhood. Very close. Close enough to make me stop drinking my coffee. At exactly 10:03 that morning, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly a year, Nolan Wexford, the attorney who had helped Raymond and me establish our family trust decades earlier. Nolan was 76 now, sharp as broken glass, and entirely unimpressed by human stupidity. His receptionist squeezed me in that afternoon. By 2 o'clock, I was sitting across from him in his office above an old pharmacy downtown. The walls were lined with legal books. Most looked older than some college students. Nolan listened without interrupting while I explained everything: the tattoo, the dinner, the questions, the brochure. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. That was all. Just, I've learned that when experienced lawyers become quiet, you should pay attention. Finally, he folded his hands. Have you spoken to Calvin? No. Good. That surprised me. Good? Very good. He removed his glasses. If your instincts are correct, talking to him right now accomplishes nothing. I stared at him. You think my instincts are correct? Nolan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened a cabinet and removed a thick file. The Ashford Family Trust. I recognized the folder instantly. The sight of it made my stomach tighten. Nolan flipped through several pages, then stopped. Blythe, tell me something. All right. Does Calvin understand the actual ownership structure of the house? I hesitated. More or less. Nolan laughed, a short, humorless laugh. That's not what I asked. The room suddenly felt smaller. I thought about it honestly, about the conversations over the years, the assumptions Calvin made, the things he never bothered reading, the documents he always skimmed. Finally, I sighed. No. Nolan nodded. That's what I suspected. A lot of people think the tattoo was the biggest betrayal. I don't. My verdict? The tattoo was just advertising. This meeting was the real danger. When somebody publicly paints you as unstable and privately slides authority papers across a table, that's not family concern. That's strategy. And Blythe was finally starting to see the entire board. The following Tuesday, I stopped trying to guess. Guessing is what people do when they don't have access to facts. Facts were easier. Facts don't care about feelings. So I went looking for them. The answer arrived through someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly 8 years. Martha Greeley, 81 years old. Sharp-tongued, impossible to intimidate. And the unofficial queen of Cedar Hollow's Historical Society. If a building in town had survived longer than a decade, Martha probably knew its entire life story. I found her inside the Historical Society archives, occupying her usual corner desk beneath a portrait of some long-forgotten mayor. Blythe Ashford, she said, lowering her glasses. Either you've come to volunteer or something's wrong. Definitely the second one. That earned a smile. An hour later, we sat surrounded by maps, survey records, photographs, and enough dusty paperwork to trigger allergies in 3 counties. I explained what little I knew about Harrow and Vale, the proposed development, the surrounding properties, the pressure Calvin seemed to be building. Martha listened quietly. Then she asked one question. Which parcel are they desperate for? I gave her the address. Her eyebrows immediately rose. That's interesting. Why? Instead of answering, she disappeared into a back room. When she returned, she carried a large archival box. The cardboard looked older than some marriages. She placed it on the table and carefully removed several yellowed documents, property surveys, historic maps, photographs. Then she slid one image toward me. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. Then I recognized it. The old workshop. Raymond's workshop. The structure sitting behind Calvin's house. The same one everyone ignored. The same weathered building filled with old woodworking tools, antique workbenches, and decades of dust. Why am I looking at this? Martha tapped the photograph. Because this isn't just an old workshop. I frowned. What is it? A preserved 19th century carriage repair building. I stared at her. She stared back. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Finally, I laughed. You're kidding? I'm not. She pulled another document from the box. a preservation survey completed years earlier. Apparently, long before Raymond ever owned the property, local historians had identified the structure as one of the last remaining examples of its kind in the county. The designation process had never been completed. Funding disappeared. Projects changed. People forgot. But the documentation remained, waiting. My pulse quickened. Does Harrow know this? I doubt it. What happens if the site receives historic protection? Martha's smile widened. Then demolition becomes very complicated. Complicated. Developers hate complicated. I suddenly understood why she looked so pleased. The workshop wasn't valuable because of what it was. It was valuable because it could stop what someone else wanted. For the next 2 hours, Martha showed me records, reports, photographs, and preservation recommendations that had been sitting unnoticed for decades. By the time we finished, I wasn't looking at a forgotten workshop anymore. I was looking at leverage, legal leverage, powerful leverage, and perhaps the first truly unexpected piece on the board. As I gathered copies of the documents, Martha folded her arms. "You know," she said, "developers usually move fast when they think nobody's paying attention." I nodded. "I've noticed." She studied me carefully. Then her expression softened. "Your husband loved that workshop." The words hit harder than I expected, because it was true. Raymond had spent countless evenings there, building cabinets, repairing furniture, teaching Calvin how to use tools, creating things with his hands. For years, I'd viewed the workshop as little more than a memory. Now I realized it might become something else. Protection. When I finally left the Historical Society, the sun was beginning to set. The copies sat on the passenger seat beside me. For the first time in weeks, I felt something dangerous. Hope. Not because I'd won, not even close, but because for the first time since that charity dinner, I had discovered something Calvin didn't know. And in every battle, the most valuable thing in the world is information your opponent doesn't realize exists. 3 days after my visit to the Historical Society, Calvin called again. His timing was becoming predictable. Every time I discovered something new, he somehow seemed to sense that control was slipping. "Mom?" His voice sounded unusually warm. That alone made me suspicious. "Calvin." I was thinking. Dangerous words. "What about?" "Maybe we got off on the wrong foot at the cafe." I nearly laughed. At 69, I'd learned that people only use phrases like wrong foot when they want to avoid discussing the actual foot that kicked the door down. Maybe. "I don't want us fighting." There it was again. The same script. The same carefully measured concern. Then he suggested dinner. Not at his house. Not in public. At mine. A detail that immediately caught my attention. He wanted to enter my territory, to look around, to evaluate, maybe even to search for something. I agreed anyway, because by then I had stopped avoiding information. Information was useful, and Calvin tended to reveal more than he realized. The following evening, he arrived carrying a bottle of wine and a bakery box. An unusual level of effort. The moment I opened the door, he smiled. For a second, I saw the little boy he used to be. Then the illusion vanished. People often mistake familiarity for trust. The two aren't the same thing. We sat in the kitchen. I served chicken pot pie. The same recipe I'd been making for nearly 30 years. For a while, the conversation remained harmless. Weather, the town, a new restaurant opening near Main Street. Then Calvin began steering things, slowly, subtly, toward exactly where he wanted them. How's your memory these days? There it was, right on schedule. I continued eating. Fine. You sure? Pretty sure. He chuckled. I'm serious. So am I. His smile faded slightly. A few minutes later, he tried another angle. Do you ever feel overwhelmed handling everything yourself? No. What about finances? No. Paperwork? No. The repetition began irritating him. Good. I wanted irritation. People reveal themselves faster when they stop feeling comfortable. Then he made a mistake. A small one, but important. You know, if something happened suddenly, it could create a mess with the trust. I froze internally, not externally. Never externally. But internally, every alarm bell rang at once. The trust. Interesting. Because I'd never mentioned the trust during our cafe meeting. Not once. Yet here he was, bringing it up again, like a man circling a locked door. I set down my fork. What specifically concerns you? For a brief moment, Calvin hesitated, then recovered. I'm just thinking ahead. Of course. Always thinking ahead. Always planning, always preparing. The conversation continued another 20 minutes. The longer we talked, the more obvious his frustration became. He wasn't gathering information. He was checking progress, like someone waiting for a fruit to ripen. Finally, he stood to leave. We walked toward the front door together. Then he paused, his eyes drifting toward Raymond's old workshop, visible through the backyard window. The workshop. The very building Martha had spent hours discussing. The building that suddenly mattered. What are you going to do with that thing? His tone sounded casual. Too casual. I followed his gaze. The workshop? Yeah. I shrugged. Nothing. It's falling apart. No, it isn't. It probably should come down eventually. There it was, not a suggestion. A preference. A very specific preference. I looked at him carefully. Your father loved that building. Calvin's expression tightened. That doesn't make it useful. Useful. Interesting choice of word. Developers love useful. Investors love useful. People planning demolition love useful. The silence stretched. Then he smiled again. Too quickly. Just a thought. I nodded. Of course. A thought. Nothing more, except it wasn't. Because during the entire evening, that was the only thing he'd shown genuine interest in. Not me. Not my health. Not our relationship. The workshop. The moment he drove away, I locked the door and returned to the kitchen. Then I opened my notebook. 1 page, 1 sentence. Calvin specifically wants the workshop removed. I underlined it twice, because instinct was no longer enough. Facts were accumulating. Patterns were emerging. And for the first time, I could almost see the shape of the trap my son had been building. The problem for Calvin was simple. He still thought I was standing inside it. What he didn't realize was that I'd already found the exit, and very soon I intended to lock the gate behind me. The next week changed everything. Not because of something Calvin did, because of something I discovered. Up until then, I'd been collecting pieces, questions, documents, conversations, patterns, enough to suspect a plan, not enough to prove one. Then Nolan called. It was Tuesday morning. I was halfway through watering the hydrangeas when my phone rang. His voice sounded unusually serious. "Blythe, I think you'd better come in." That was all he said. No explanation, no details. Just enough to tell me something important had surfaced. 40 minutes later, I was sitting across from him again. The same office, the same walls of legal books. But this time, Nolan already had a folder waiting on his desk. And judging by his expression, he wasn't happy. "What happened?" I asked. Instead of answering, he slid several documents toward me. At first glance, they looked harmless. Routine paperwork. Requests, applications, formal inquiries. Then I saw the name, Calvin Ashford. My stomach tightened. What am I looking at? Nolan removed his glasses. An early-stage petition package. The room became very quiet. I read further. And suddenly, my blood ran cold. Because there it was, page after page, references to age, capacity concerns, decision-making ability, financial oversight, medical evaluation recommendations, not filed yet, not approved, but drafted, prepared, waiting. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Then I looked up. He was actually going to do it. Nolan nodded, slowly. He was preparing to. A strange feeling washed over me. Not shock, not sadness. Confirmation. The kind that arrives when your worst suspicion finally becomes fact. Everything suddenly fit. The healthcare consultant, the cognitive assessment, the questions to neighbors, the concern about my memory, the authority forms, the conversations, the narrative. It had never been random. It had been construction. Brick by brick, story by story, creating a version of Blythe Ashford that could eventually be presented to a court, confused, vulnerable, declining, in need of assistance, in need of supervision, in need of someone else making decisions. And that someone would have been Calvin. I stared at the paperwork. Years ago, this discovery would have broken me. Not anymore, because another realization arrived at the same moment. If Calvin had already prepared documents like these, then he was running out of patience. People don't draft legal moves unless they intend to use them. Soon, very soon. How close was he? I asked. Nolan considered the question carefully. Closer than I'd like. I nodded, then sat quietly for a moment. Looking at the papers. Looking at my son's name. Looking at the future he'd been preparing for me, without my knowledge. And something unexpected happened. I stopped feeling guilty. For weeks, I'd wrestled with uncomfortable questions. Had I been too strict when Calvin was young? Too demanding after Raymond died? Too focused on responsibility and not enough on comfort? The answer was probably yes. I wasn't a perfect mother. No mother is. But none of those failures justified this. Nothing did. Not the tattoo, not the lies, not the attempt to erase my authority over my own life. For the first time, I separated two truths. I could have made mistakes, and Calvin could still be wrong. The two things could exist together. That realization felt strangely freeing. When I finally stood to leave, Nolan handed me a copy of the documents. Keep these. I slipped them into my bag. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected off the courthouse windows. People crossed the street carrying coffee cups and shopping bags. Normal lives. normal days. Meanwhile, my own son had been quietly preparing a legal argument that I was no longer capable of running my own affairs. The thought should have devastated me. Instead, it sharpened my focus, because now I knew exactly what was happening. And knowledge changes everything. As I walked toward my car, my phone buzzed. A new message from Calvin. "Hey, Mom. Just checking in. Hope you're doing okay. Love you." I stared at the screen for several seconds, then laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. A man preparing to take control of my life was asking whether I was doing okay. I slipped the phone back into my purse. For the first time since all this started, I wasn't reacting to Calvin's moves anymore. I was waiting for the right moment to make my own. And when that moment came, it wouldn't involve arguments. It wouldn't involve revenge. It would involve paperwork. The one language my son apparently respected more than family. The moment arrived sooner than I expected. 2 weeks after Nolan showed me the draft petition, I received a call from Martha Greeley. She sounded almost cheerful, which coming from Martha usually meant somebody else's plans were about to collapse. "Blythe," she said, "you need to come down here." Good news? The kind that makes developers lose sleep. 30 minutes later, I was sitting across from her inside the Historical Society archives. Several new folders sat on the table. More documents, more surveys, more records. But these weren't old. These were current. Very current. Martha pushed the top file toward me. The Preservation Board reviewed the workshop. My pulse quickened. And? A slow smile appeared. They approved emergency historic designation. For a second, I just stared at her. Then I read the letter myself. Official county seal. Official signatures. Official approval. The workshop behind Calvin's house, Raymond's workshop, was now protected. Demolition restrictions. Structural protections. Mandatory review procedures. Layers of legal complications developers hated. The exact thing Harrow and Vale had been hoping to avoid. I sat back in my chair. For the first time in months, I felt something close to relief. Not victory. Relief. Because now the land wasn't simply valuable, it was difficult. And difficult properties don't make developers rich. Martha folded her arms. They won't like this. No. They'll probably walk away. I know. The smile widened. That's why I like it. I couldn't help laughing. 3 hours later, Nolan called. His timing was becoming almost supernatural. "You're going to enjoy this." I could use some good news. Then sit down. I already was. Nolan sounded pleased. Very pleased. "The trust has received a formal purchase offer." I frowned. A purchase offer. From the Cedar Hollow Preservation Trust. The room went silent. I knew who they were. A nonprofit organization focused on preserving historic sites. The same group that occasionally stepped in when properties faced aggressive redevelopment. They want the entire parcel? Workshop included. I closed my eyes. Suddenly, everything became clear. The workshop, the land, the protection status, the development pressure. For the first time, there was another option. One Calvin couldn't control, one Harrow couldn't influence. One that permanently removed the property from speculative development. "What's the offer?" Nolan told me. I nearly dropped the phone. The number exceeded every realistic expectation I'd had. Apparently, historic preservation groups moved quickly when opportunities appeared. especially opportunities connected to protected structures. When the call ended, I sat alone in my kitchen for a long time, thinking, not about money, about consequences. Because if I accepted that offer, everything changed. The development deal died. The land disappeared from Calvin's reach. And most importantly, the property stopped being a tool anyone could use against me. 2 days later, I signed the paperwork. Quietly. No announcements, no confrontation, no warning, just signatures, dates, witnesses, done. The official closing was scheduled for the following week, which meant Calvin remained completely unaware, at least for now. That didn't last long. 3 evenings later, my front doorbell rang. Hard. 3 sharp presses, not a visitor, an interruption. I opened the door and immediately saw Calvin. His face told me everything. He knew, not all of it, but enough. What did you do? No greeting, no smile, no concern for my well-being. Straight to the point. I almost appreciated the honesty. What are you talking about? His jaw tightened. The property. There it was. Not the workshop, not the trust, not me, the property. I folded my arms. What about it? For several seconds, he simply stared. Then the anger broke through. People are saying you met with the Preservation Trust. Interesting. People were talking already. Good. That meant the process was moving. I meet lots of people. Stop it. His voice rose. For the first time, genuine panic appeared. Not concern, panic. The kind people feel when something valuable starts slipping away. And in that moment, I finally understood what had been driving him all along. It wasn't hatred. Hatred would have been simpler. It was entitlement. The belief that my future belonged to him, that my property belonged to him, that eventually everything I had would naturally become his. And now that future was disappearing, right in front of him, without his permission. The realization hit him almost as hard as it had hit me weeks earlier. The difference was simple. I had accepted reality. Calvin was still trying to negotiate with it. Here's my verdict. The tattoo hurt. The lies were ugly. But this? This is where the story changes. Because Calvin finally discovered something many entitled people learned too late. Inheritance isn't ownership. Expectation isn't ownership. And planning someone else's future doesn't make it yours. By this point, Blythe wasn't playing defense anymore. She was quietly taking the entire board off the table. The next 10 days were chaos. Not for me, for Calvin. The first sign arrived through town gossip. In Cedar Hollow, news travels faster than weather. By Monday afternoon, half the town knew that Harrow and Vale had suddenly stopped scheduling meetings related to the Eastern Development Corridor. By Wednesday, people were whispering that investors were getting nervous. By Friday, nobody was whispering anymore. They were talking openly. The project was stalling, and everyone wanted to know why. I didn't need to ask. I already knew. The workshop had become radioactive. The preservation designation changed everything. Environmental reviews, historic reviews, public hearings, additional approvals. Months of delays, possibly years. For developers, uncertainty is poison. For investors, it's worse. Apparently, several of Harrow's partners agreed, because one by one, they started pulling back. Then came the phone calls, not from Calvin, from other people. People I'd never met. People suddenly interested in having friendly conversations. One businessman suggested lunch. Another wanted to discuss community opportunities. A third offered to help find a solution that benefits everyone. The funny thing about age is that eventually you stop confusing politeness with sincerity. I declined every invitation. Meanwhile, Calvin's situation deteriorated. Fast. Much faster than I'd expected. The first real crack appeared when Kelsey left. I learned that through Earl Patterson. Of course, Earl knew everything. Apparently, she'd moved out over a weekend. No dramatic goodbye, no public argument, just packed boxes and a rented truck. Gone. A few days later, another rumor surfaced. Ronan Pike, the outdoor sauna genius who had been selling dreams to investors, was suddenly difficult to reach, then impossible, then missing entirely. The phrase floating around town was cash flow complications. I've heard enough courtroom language to know a euphemism when I see one. Something had collapsed, and people were looking for someone to blame. That someone wasn't Harrow, it wasn't Ronan, it was Calvin, the local face of the project, the man who had convinced people everything was moving forward. One rainy afternoon, I was organizing books in my living room when someone knocked on my front door. I expected a neighbor. Instead, I found Judge Eleanor Finch, the same retired judge from the charity dinner. "May I come in?" A few minutes later, we sat with tea at my kitchen table. She got straight to the point. "Calvin came to see me." That surprised me. "He did?" She nodded. "2 days ago." "And?" For a moment, she looked genuinely sad. "He wanted advice." I waited. "He said everything was falling apart." I stared into my tea. Not because I enjoyed hearing it, because part of me still remembered the little boy with popsicle stick boats. The boy existed. He always would. Unfortunately, so did the man. Judge Finch watched me carefully. "Do you know what struck me?" "What?" "He never talked about losing you." The words landed softly, but they landed hard. "He talked about losing the property." Silence settled between us. Then she continued. "The development, the investors, the opportunity." Another pause. Not once did he ask how to repair the relationship. I closed my eyes briefly, because that was exactly what I'd feared. Judge Finch eventually left, but her words stayed behind. That night, I sat on my back porch, watching rain move across the yard. The workshop stood in the darkness beyond the trees, still there, still protected, still stubbornly surviving. Just like Raymond would have wanted. Then my phone buzzed, a text message. From Calvin. The first message in nearly a week. I expected anger, accusations, demands. Instead, I received a photograph. His forearm, the tattoo, or what remained of it. The words were partially hidden beneath fresh black ink. An unfinished cover-up. Dark shapes, feathers, branches, the old sentence disappearing underneath new artwork. Beneath the photo was a single message. I should have never done it. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then another message appeared. "Can we talk?" For several minutes, I didn't move. Outside, rain tapped against the porch roof. Inside, my phone remained in my hand. Because, after everything that had happened, one truth remained. A tattoo can be covered, land can be sold, projects can fail, money can disappear. But trust? Trust is the one thing that rarely survives demolition, and mine was already buried under too much rubble. I never replied to Calvin's text. Not that night. Not the next day. Not the day after that. Some people would call that cruel. Maybe they're right. But there comes a point when silence isn't punishment. It's distance. And distance was the only thing that had finally brought me peace. 2 weeks later, the sale officially closed. The Cedar Hollow Preservation Trust took ownership of the property, the workshop, the surrounding land, everything. Just like that, decades of uncertainty disappeared. No development project, no future acquisition, no hidden pathway to control. Done. Permanent. The same word Calvin had been so proud of when he stood on that stage. Permanent. Funny how differently life can define it. By autumn, I was gone, not dramatically. No farewell speech, no confrontation, no last argument on a front lawn. I packed my belongings, sold my house, and moved nearly 600 miles north to a small coastal town in Maine called Brackenmere. The kind of place where fishing boats leave before sunrise, and everyone knows which bakery makes the best blueberry turnovers. For the first few weeks, nobody knew who I was. And for the first time in years, that felt wonderful. I rented a small storefront near the harbor and opened something modest. A tiny shop filled with old books, handwritten journals, maps, antique tools, and forgotten objects that deserved better than being thrown away. I called it the Quiet Ledger. The name seemed appropriate. After all, my entire life had been spent recording things. Testimony, memories, truths. Now I spent my days preserving them. The business wasn't spectacular. It didn't need to be. I was comfortable. Happy, even. A word I hadn't used much during the previous few years. Then, one rainy November afternoon, a letter arrived. No return address. But I recognized the handwriting immediately. Calvin. I considered throwing it away. Instead, I opened it. Inside was a photograph. The same arm. The same tattoo. Only now the words had vanished completely. A large black raven covered the old sentence. The insult was gone, at least visually. The second item was a letter, 3 pages. No excuses, no complaints, no explanations about investors, no blame directed toward me, just accountability. For the first time since all of this began, Calvin sounded honest. He admitted he'd become obsessed with opportunities, obsessed with money, obsessed with proving himself. He admitted he'd convinced himself that everything would eventually belong to him anyway. The property, the trust, the future. And once he started believing that story, every obstacle began looking like an enemy, including me. When I reached the final page, I found the sentence that mattered most. I spent so much time trying to inherit your life that I forgot to have one of my own. I read it twice, then a third time. And despite everything, tears finally came. Not because I wanted him back. Not because everything was fixed. Because for the first time, I believed he understood. Understanding and forgiveness are not the same thing. Many people confuse them. I don't. Understanding simply means seeing clearly. And I finally did. That evening, I sat alone in my shop after closing. The harbor lights reflected across the water. Wind rattled the window. The letter rested beside me. I took out a blank sheet of paper, and I wrote a response. Not an angry one, not a loving one either. Just honest. I told Calvin I hoped he built a good life. I hoped he found peace. I hoped he learned the difference between success and entitlement. and I hoped he never again treated another person as an obstacle standing between him and what he wanted. Then I folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and locked it inside a drawer. I never mailed it. Some conversations don't need to happen. Some answers are meant for the person writing them, not the person receiving them. As the months passed, life continued. Customers came and went. Fishing boats left before dawn. Seagulls screamed outside my windows. And every now and then I would think about Calvin. Not with anger, not with bitterness, just acceptance. Because the truth is simple. My son covered his tattoo. But he couldn't cover the day he chose it, just as I sold the property. But I couldn't erase the years that led us there. We both made permanent decisions. The difference was that mine finally gave me freedom. And if you're wondering whether I ever saw him again, no, I didn't. Sometimes an ending isn't a tragedy. Sometimes it's a boundary. And after 69 years, I finally learned the difference. Personally, I don't think I would have disappeared completely. I might have made Calvin tell the truth publicly before walking away. But I understand Blythe's choice. Some relationships don't end because love disappears. They end because respect does. So tell me, would you have forgiven Calvin? Or would you have done exactly what Blythe did? Like the video, subscribe, and share your thoughts below.